now. Okay. Morning, everyone. Today we are going to talk about the only topic that we're going to talk about today is Black Death. That's the only topic we're going to talk. Okay. Now, I brought some information that I want you to share it with you guys. You only pay attention. Okay. Only pay attention. Okay.
Main idea. The Black Death led to social changes. The Black Death. While the English and French fought the 100 Years' War, an even greater crisis arose. This crisis was the Black Death. The plague originally came from Central and Eastern Asia. Unknowingly, traders brought rats carrying the disease to Mediterranean ports in 1347. From there, it quickly swept throughout much of Europe. Fleas that feasted on the blood of infected rats passed on the plague to people. The Black Death was not caused by one disease, but by several different forms of plague. One form, called bubonic plague, could be identified by swellings called buboes that appeared on victims' bodies. Another, even deadlier form could spread through the air and kill people in less than a day. The Black Death killed so many people that many were buried quickly without priests or ceremonies. In some villages, nearly everyone died or fled as neighbors fell ill. In England alone, about 1,000 villages were abandoned.
The Black Death, and they died by the hundreds, wrote one man who saw the horror, both day and night. The Black Death had arrived. The Black Death was a series of deadly plagues that hit Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing millions. People didn't know what caused the plague. They also didn't know that geography played a key role in its spread. As people dig mass graves to bury the dead, but often, so many victims are infected that there is no one left to bury them. The plague is so terrifying that many people think it's the end of the world. They leave town for the country, spreading the Black Death even farther. This ship has just arrived in Europe from the east with trade goods and rats with fleas. The fleas that carry the plague jump onto a man unloading the ship. Soon, he will get sick and die. The garbage and dirty conditions in the town provide food and a home for the rats, allowing the disease to spread even more. So many people die so quickly that special carts are sent through the streets to gather the bodies. The plague probably began in Central and Eastern Asia. These arrows show how it spread into and through Europe.
Okay, I don't have any other information here. Let's move on and watch. Okay, is this Black Death? Yes, just read it.
The delirious victim staggers about in his final moments. His speech is slurred, skin purple-black, covered with swollen, pus-filled lumps as death calls him. Witnesses to this terrifying spectacle called it the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. In the 14th century, a terrible catastrophe fell upon Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa that would change the course of history. The Black Death. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, was an outbreak of disease that killed 1/3 of the European population in the period 1347 to 1350. It had a similarly devastating impact in Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. The disease played no favorites, rich and poor, young and old, priest and peasant, all fell victim to this horrible and, at the time, unexplained sickness, which was spreading like wildfire. The populations of entire towns and villages were wiped out in a matter of days. The dead were buried in mass graves to cope with the rapid death toll. Only a thin covering of soil was placed over the dead bodies before another layer was buried on top. Pope Clement VI consecrated, made sacred, the Rhone River so corpses could be thrown straight into it. So, what is the Black Death? Where did it come from? While it's difficult to trace with any real certainty, the outbreak is believed to have originated in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, early in the 14th century. Prior to this, the disease had existed for centuries in regions of Asia, with small outbreaks occurring from time to time. Any one of these could have been the source. Once infected, the victim would first experience a high fever, aching limbs, and fatigue. Within days, the lymph nodes in the neck, armpits, and groin would start to swell and turn black. These black swellings are where the Black Death gets its name. Michael Placentius, first-hand witness to the horrors of the Black Death, wrote, "Here, not only the burn blisters appeared, but there have developed gland boils on the groin, the thighs, the arms, or on the neck. At first, these were the size of a hazelnut and developed accompanied by violent shivering fits, which soon rendered those attacks so weak that they could not stand up, but were forced to lie in their beds, consumed by violent fever. Soon the boils grew to be the size of a walnut, then to that of a hen's egg or a goose's egg, and they were exceedingly painful and irritated the body, causing the sufferer to vomit blood. The sickness lasted 3 days, and on the 4th, the latest, the patient succumbed. The stinking pus-filled swellings, otherwise known as buboes, gave the bubonic plague its name. Their nervous system under attack, victims would become crazed and delirious with fever. Once the swollen lymph nodes started to burst within the body, the sufferer was not long for this world. Death usually occurred within the week. By the time the infected person who had introduced the disease to the port, town, or village died, others would already be in the early stages of infection. This made preventing an epidemic incredibly difficult. The outbreak of the Black Death in the 14th century actually involved 3 different strains of plague. The most common and visually the most gruesome form is the bubonic plague. The second form was the pneumonic plague. It infects the respiratory system once the bubonic strain reaches the lungs. The third form, septicemic plague, infects the body's circulatory system, that is, the blood. The bubonic plague is actually the weakest of the 3 strains. During the worst outbreaks of the Black Death, pneumonic and septicemic plague had mortality rates of almost 100%. It's believed malnutrition played a major role in making the symptoms more dramatic. Many who died had endured years of famine, the result of severe storms and drought, making their weakened immune system vulnerable.
Profe, cuando él explicaba como las
¿Cómo?
bubonic plague, ¿y cuáles eran las otras 2?
Otras plagas.
Ah, porque él decía que primero empezaba con el bubonic plague, después con los pulmones, ¿no? Pero ¿cómo se llamaba eso?
¿Se llamaba qué? Ya ver esto y después hablamos. ¿Ya?
Imagine if half the people in your neighborhood, your city, or even your whole country were wiped out. It might sound like something out of an apocalyptic horror film, but it actually happened in the 14th century during a disease outbreak known as the Black Death. Spreading from China through Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, the devastating epidemic destroyed as much as 1/5 of the world's population, killing nearly 50% of Europeans in just 4 years. One of the most fascinating and puzzling things about the Black Death is that the illness itself was not a new phenomenon, but one that has affected humans for centuries. DNA analysis of bone and tooth samples from this period, as well as an earlier epidemic known as the Plague of Justinian in 541 CE, has revealed that both were caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that causes bubonic plague today. What this means is that the same disease caused by the same pathogen can behave and spread very differently throughout history. Even before the use of antibiotics, the deadliest outbreaks in modern times, such as the ones that occurred in early 20th century India, killed no more than 3% of the population. Modern instances of plague also tend to remain localized or travel slowly, as they are spread by rodent fleas. But the medieval Black Death, which spread like wildfire, was most likely communicated directly from one person to another. And because genetic comparisons of ancient and modern strains of Yersinia pestis have not revealed any significantly functional genetic differences, the key to why the earlier outbreak was so much deadlier must lie not in the parasite, but the host. For about 300 years during the High Middle Ages, a warmer climate and agricultural improvements had led to explosive population growth throughout Europe. But with so many new mouths to feed, the end of this warm period spelled disaster. High fertility rates combined with reduced harvests meant the land could no longer support its population, while the abundant supply of labor kept wages low. As a result, most Europeans in the early 14th century experienced a steady decline in living standards, marked by famine, poverty, and poor health, leaving them vulnerable to infection. And indeed, the skeletal remains of Black Death victims found in London show telltale signs of malnutrition and prior illness. The destruction caused by the Black Death changed humanity in two important ways. On a societal level, the rapid loss of population led to important changes in Europe's economic conditions. With more food to go around, as well as more land and better pay for the surviving farmers and workers, people began to eat better and live longer, as studies of London cemeteries have shown. Higher living standards also brought an increase in social mobility, weakening feudalism, and eventually leading to political reforms. But the plague also had an important biological impact. The sudden death of so many of the most frail and vulnerable people left behind a population with a significantly different gene pool, including genes that may have helped survivors resist the disease. And because such mutations often confer immunities to multiple pathogens that work in similar ways, research to discover the genetic consequences of the Black Death has the potential to be hugely beneficial. Today, the threat of an epidemic on the scale of the Black Death has been largely eliminated thanks to antibiotics. But the bubonic plague continues to kill a few thousand people worldwide every year. And the recent emergence of a drug-resistant strain threatens the return of darker times. Learning more about the causes and effects of the Black Death is important, not just for understanding how our world has been shaped by the past. It may also help save us from a similar nightmare in the future.
Creo que escuchaste la respuesta, ¿no? En realidad fueron varios varias enfermedades que se fueron, pienso yo que fueron mutando, ¿no? Y ahora en la actualidad está la fiebre bubónica, esa es la que están hablando ahí, pues, que todavía no se ha podido controlar, ¿no? Pero a pesar de todo, mira ahora lo del coronavirus ha afectado a varios, o sea que durante todas las épocas siempre ha existido una especie de virus que ha afectado a la humanidad. Y en aquel entonces, no es que diga que hizo bien, pero en aquel entonces por lo menos se controló la población, ¿ves? Porque como dice ahí,
Claro, porque no viajaban.
creció mucho la población y entonces vino esta enfermedad para tratar de reducir. Sin embargo, a un alto costo, que muera gente no es tampoco bueno, pero a veces la naturaleza sabe lo que hace, ¿ves? Vamos a ver este otro. Y este creo que es el último, ya. No hay.
El bubonic plague es como un derivado de lo que...
Sí, ajá, correcto. No es el mismo, son diferentes.
Our Earth is like a treasure
No son los mismos, son diferentes.
Plague is
Pero
notorious
definitivamente el resultado es lo mismo. Lastimosamente.
for causing mass sickness and devastation. But as much tragedy as the disease has caused, it also helped drive crucial scientific and social progress. Plague is an infectious disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It mainly affects rodents and spreads by way of insects.
Así se llama Yersinia, déjame ver cómo que se llama. Ahí está, Yersinia pestis.
It mainly affects rodents and spreads by way of insects. Because of these insect carriers, plague has been passed on to humans with devastating consequences. 3 major plague pandemics have occurred in human history. And while they occurred centuries apart, they shared similar traits that paved the way for the spread of disease. One cause of plague pandemics was the rise of international trade. Trade routes connected once isolated communities and created large economic networks. But by facilitating the movement of goods between communities, trade routes also facilitated the movement of germs. International trade was an impetus for the first plague pandemic on record, the Plague of Justinian. In the 6th century, outbreaks began in Egypt, and thanks to land and sea trade routes, they spread throughout the Byzantine Empire. Named after the emperor at the time, the Plague of Justinian is estimated to have wiped out about half of Europe's population.
Wow.
Growing economies also made way for urbanization and a rising urban population. This resulted in crowded neighborhoods and the accumulation of waste, which created unsanitary living conditions. Cities and their residents essentially became incubators for germs and diseases. This was particularly evident in the second and most infamous plague pandemic. In the 14th century, Europe was experiencing an economic and population boom, especially in cities. Proper waste management did not exist at the time, making cities vulnerable to disease. After trade routes brought plague from Asia, where it killed millions in China and the Middle East, the disease wiped out about 1/3 of Europe's population, earning itself the moniker, the Black Death. What also aided in the transmission of the disease was the lack of medical knowledge. For most of human history, the cause of illnesses, germs, was unknown, making sicknesses like the plague a mystery. This lack of knowledge drove the spread of disease as recently as the 19th century. Outbreaks in northwest India eventually reached major port cities in China. In just over a century, plague was exported throughout the globe and caused outbreaks in every continent except Antarctica, making it the most widespread pandemic in history. This plague pandemic, however, was the last. In 1894, scientists discovered the bacteria behind the plague outbreaks. Their discovery helped further developments in microbiology, medicine, urban planning, and sanitation methods, which led to the treatment and prevention of the disease. Economic expansion, urbanization, and a lack of medical knowledge contributed to the disastrous spread of plague. In turn, however, the disease helped catapult crucial advancements in science and public health, very well making plague pandemics a thing of the past.
Okie dokie, that's enough for stop right there. That's enough for today. We have it's 10:42, 3 minutes left. Hope you enjoy.